Without further ado, Rick Ramgattie with Hook, Line, and Tinker.
I had prepared my own intro, so I'm just going to do it anyways because I don't want to get off the normal vibe that I had with this. So welcome, everyone. This is Hook, Line, and Tinker, a dive into phishing sites, presented by me, Rick Ramgattie. So first, the obligatory who am I slide. I'm an AppSec engineer, and I work at Gemini Trust Company. I've been doing AppSec for about 8 years now. For the first 4, I was a security consultant at a place called Independent Security Evaluators, and since then, I've been working at Gemini. One of the nice things about being able to work on an internal application security team is that I've been able to embed myself with some of the other security teams and departments. And yeah, that's the thing that ended up inspiring my threat hunting, which is now a hobby and hopefully also part of my career. For today's agenda, I've split the talk up into 3 different stories. It used to be 4, so if you read the description, that's the difference there. I couldn't do the whole thing in 30 minutes. And these were instances where I thought that looking at a phishing site and digging into how it works provided me with information that helped me improve security posture. And while you're looking at all these adventures with me, the focus of the talk is going to be about what I did and how I analyzed these sites to extract information that helped me carry out some kind of security requirement. Before we talk about any kind of security, technical details, I wanted to give you a notice to please play at your own risk. Remember that what I did here was interacting with adversary infrastructure, which is inherently dangerous and should be done carefully. In my case, I may have naively done this in a very simple way. I have a Chromebook, and on that Chromebook, I'm just running Burp Suite, Firefox, and Molvad. So in this case, all of the instances that we're going to be looking at today involved a site, and seemed like the best bet for me was Burp Suite, and I just wanted something isolated from my normal personal environment, so I bought a Chromebook for that. So now that I've given you the warning and you know who I am and all that, let's talk about the first instance, which I called proxy ATOs. So I got into this because a friend hit me up and they said, hey, at our Zendesk instance, we're getting a bunch of emails where users are saying that they got phished and their accounts got cleaned up. So when they were looking into that, they looked over all of the tickets and they said, hey, the majority of our users that have been phished over this time span have visited one of 4 phishing sites, but they were all phished. And in this case, they were worried not because of there was a vulnerability in their platform, but because they thought that users were losing money meant bad news for their company because the users wouldn't trust the brand anymore. They're worried about their reputation. They had pretty normally reported it to their brand protection vendor. For those of you who work in internal security teams, this is usually what you do. You just engage with somebody ZeroFox, and you say hey, these are phishing sites, please take them down. And they just handle it for you. They talk to the registrars and all that jazz. In this case, they had done that, but the registrar wasn't responsive. They had learned that the attacker bought a domain name and something called a bulletproof registrar, and it's that was enough to make this attack last a good while. It had lasted weeks at this point. And then the last thing was that they had reported everything to safe browsing, but it still hadn't kicked in. So safe browsing is just that red screen that you see sometimes when you go to a site that you shouldn't. They had reported everything to them, but it looked like safe browsing's automation hadn't kicked in, and they hadn't analyzed and identified these as phishing sites. And a couple of days had gone by. So I signed an NDA with them, which is why I can't talk about their name, but they asked me to help them figure out how they can get ahead of this. So these were the 3 questions that we started off with. How do we prevent these users from getting phished? How can we identify the victims more quickly? And how can we accelerate the takedown time to disrupt the campaign? Overall, the goal was reduce user losses, because again, it's a huge impact on your brand, and also if your brand depends on users having money with you and the money is gone, your users are not going to engage with you, you're not going to be able to make anything. Those 3 questions resulted in another 3 questions, which was, I asked them, do they understand how the phish works? Were there any commonalities with all the users that reported that they got phished? And then the other one was, do they understand the infrastructure of the phishing sites? The answer to all of these was no. And when I asked myself these questions, I was trying to figure out how I could do that. And the answer to that seemed like I just needed to get phished. So I went ahead and did that. On the left-hand side, I just, like my little hobbyist setup, I have Burp Suite. And on the right-hand side, I have the phishing site. and you can see that it's a phishing site because it has a little skull on the corner. And when I went there, tried loading it up, first thing I got was a 503. So for the first time I tried to interact with a site, I was like, I wonder how the users are doing it. Why am I getting a 503? For those of you who typically engage with sites with Burp Suite, you probably realize that it was because this was hosted behind a web application firewall, a WAF. In this case, it happened to be Cloudflare. What that meant is that Cloudflare was fingerprinting my client somehow, and it knew that I was what appeared to be a malicious client. For those of you who have done this for a while as well, you probably know that it's because the built-in Chromium that comes with Burp Suite always gets flagged by Cloudflare. So the easiest thing to do is just set Firefox up to use Burp Suite as a proxy, and you'll get a 200. But this highlights something. This highlights that automation, so in this case, our brand protection vendor that they were engaging with, tried to identify the site, but their automation failed. They also got a 503, which is why they didn't know about it. So after I got the site to load, and I was using the Firefox setup now, the first thing that I got was error password incorrect. So I put in credentials and I slid the little a CAPTCHA slider thing. And when that happened, it said password incorrect, which seemed very odd to me. How did they know that my password is incorrect? This is some random phishing site. So then I went back to the real site, I registered an account, and I tried again. And this time it said success password correct. So my spidey sense went off here because how does the site know that the first set of credentials was incorrect, but the second set of credentials that I just created were correct? So because I had fully set up the account and it already knew that, I put in my 2FA code and it went all the way through. So not only did the site know that the first set of credentials was incorrect, it knew that the second set was correct, and it knew what a valid 2FA code was. All of this together helped me realize that they must be forwarding my input to the real site. Somehow, the attacker their phishing site infrastructure somehow knew how to use the real site. So through some automation, which also seemed very odd to me, but here's more or less what I pictured that looking like. So my client hits the phishing site hits the real site, which has a cool emoji because it's the real one. And then that came back and that went back to me as well. So this is why I called it proxy ATOs, because my input was being proxied by something that I didn't know about. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The thing that really stuck out to me was that the site that I was helping secure was using a CAPTCHA. And that seems weird because I am claiming that they are using automation to interact with the site. How are they solving the CAPTCHA? And the answer to that was pretty simple. If you just Google, I just tried solving it, it's CAPTCHA solving hacks, and it just things like this came up. There are plenty CAPTCHA solvers out there. I ended up trying some out for myself, and they did in fact work. So in this case, we were able to see that the attacker was sending my input to the real site, and then after using things like CAPTCHA solvers to get around their anti-automation controls. And the they in this example is the site that I was trying to help secure. So I took all this information and I went back to the internal security team where we started discussing it. So typically, if you work with a trust and safety team or something like that, and there's users being ATO'd, you look at all the logs and you try to see what is it that's going on. So here are some simple ones that you probably ask yourself if you've looked at this in the past. The IP address for every user that I tried was different every time. So I said that I tried some fake credentials, and then we took those fake credentials and we looked at their backend to see did somebody attempt to log in with these credentials? And the answer was true. Their logs showed that somebody tried to log in with those credentials within seconds of when I put it into the phishing site. After looking at those IP addresses, there's really no way for you to know if these things are truly associated with a provider, but there's tons of telemetry services out there that get pretty close. We checked a couple of them and we learned that all the IP addresses that we had seen so far from these clients that I had put in effectively a honeypot account were all from ExpressVPN. So the other one that you're probably asking yourself is a very simple one and common, and it's user agent. But the user agent was different with every request. So there's not much you can go there. And the problem here was that if you're working at a more sophisticated place, they might have more fingerprints and signals that they can use to identify these things. However, in this case, it was a very small shop, and this is as much as they could do. The last thing that I did with them was, let's review every request that the attacker issued when they got these credentials. I wanted to see everything that they did. And here's what we learned. Once the attacker had gotten past the 2FA screen, they would say, or they would try to change the user's email address, withdraw their current balance and transfer in more money from the bank account that they had attached to the account. Looking at those are all security critical actions, right? I'm going to assume that you all said right. And that made me think, it's like, well, what are the controls in place to prevent an attacker from taking these actions? What were the fraud controls? So let's look at those a little bit more closely. In order to change your email address, you needed to have been 2FA'd within the last 10 minutes. But I just showed you that the attacker is just proxying the whole setup, and they effectively have a session that was just 2FA'd within the last 10 minutes. When we were looking at the logs, it was within seconds that these things were happening. So of course it was within the last 10 minutes. In order to withdraw the victim's current balance, the attacker needed to 2FA in the last 10 minutes, which, as we just discussed, very easy, it already happened. But then something else came up. They needed to click on a magic link sent to the victim's email address. The last thing is that in order to transfer in more money, again, you just need to be 2FA'd within the last 10 minutes. So, reviewing all of these, this one kept on sticking out to me. How is the attacker clicking on a magic link sent to the victim's email address? And sometimes when you're talking about this with a group of people, they just, like you start throwing out answers like, oh, maybe the victim is using the same password for their email address account. Or maybe they're like, the attacker's calling them and getting this information or something like that. In this case, it was a lot simpler than that. A little bit more steering will help you understand that the attacker was changing the victim's email address first, so that then the email address associated with the account was one the attacker had control of. So what if, so like thinking about that, it's like, all right, cool. Like that's why these things are done always in this order. And I learned that by looking at the logs for every single victim. So in order to fix this, you're probably asking yourself, it's like, well, what do we do to fix this? What if we just require the attacker or require the user to have access to the inbox before they change their email address? Again, the goal here is to reduce user losses. If they can't click on the magic link sent to the email address, they wouldn't be able to withdraw the money. There would be no user losses. And believe it or not, that worked. So like something simple as looking at the logs every single time might sound like something tedious, but it's essential to understanding your attacker and understanding how you can secure your user accounts. So that was like pretty much it. Like they wanted me specifically for that, just like prevent the user losses. But here were some of my takeaways. Review the fraud controls for every single security critical thing you're going to be, the attacker carried out, because that helps you understand how those are going to be met. It also learned that because their brand protection vendor hadn't detected any of these, and they were having a hard time taking them down. So learning about things like Cloudflare and how attackers are using it to, I guess like deter automation efforts really helped me build a better mental model of what I was dealing with. Also, I learned about like things like how attackers are using features like CAPTCHAs. So if you remember, when I submitted the username and password, I had to fill out one of those slide CAPTCHAs. That was, again, an effort by the attacker to hinder automated efforts leveraged against their phishing campaign. I also learned about how like simple things like CAPTCHA solvers and VPNs will likely be enough to get prevent a small shop from understanding what it is, or prevent a small shop from being able to respond to these types of attacks. And then the last thing I learned is that because this was very interesting, I did a lot more reading. These are not called proxy ATOs. These are called adversary in the middle attacks. And I'll make the slides available at the end, and you can just click on there and learn more about them. Cool. So this was my first time doing this work. And I talked to my dear boss, Dennis, who is sadly not here, but some of my coworkers are here. And I said, hey, I just did some really cool work for a company. I'd like to take this back to Gemini, where I work, and see what we can do there. So if you, I'm going to have to go back so that it has a little bit more impact. But if you remember here, when I put in the password incorrectly, it gave me an HTTP 301, and it redirected to the real site. So that stuck with me for a while. And because I was trying to figure out, it's like, why was it that they were redirecting to the real site? And it was, again, an effort to like obfuscate the existence of the phishing site. But the thing about 301 redirects, or just like redirects in general, is that it often discloses the existence of the real site. So I'm going to go back here now. I started to look into that. Dennis, my boss, gave me a couple of days, and I started looking into all of the requests for our sign-in page. And I started seeing things like what you're seeing on the right hand here. The refer header was disclosing the existence of the real phishing site. And that's a pretty common pattern. I spent some time trying to figure out why this was happening, and it was exclusively because many phishing sites will do this redirect pattern, and many of them don't know that they need to use the meta tag to like not disclose the refer header. But alas, they did not do that, which was good for me, provided an instance for a good project. So after I saw an example of like what you see on the right-hand side here of app.geminiweb.1, which does not belong to Gemini, I decided to like look a little bit more and see what else I could find. So after doing that, I found these within the first couple hours of the first day. I've organized them in a way because I'd like to highlight that these are hosting providers. These are all hosting providers that were hosting content that were perpetrating to be Gemini. You can go, if you'd like to check these out for yourself, you can go to URL scan or whatever, and they will show up there. So given that there were these many of them, I decided it's like, hey, the first time I looked at a phishing site, interacting with the phishing site helped me better understand what the attacker was doing. Maybe I should do that again. So I did that again. Here you can see, starting from the left, that I just had Bripsy with Firefox again, and this time I just cut straight to the chase because there was an image hosted on Cloudflare on one of the phishing sites. So the way that this worked was that there were all of these phishing sites, except the Azure Websites one, all pointed to the Azure Websites site. All of the ones that aren't the Azure one were just hosting a single image that when clicked, it would redirect to the real phishing site. This was, again, the attacker trying to obfuscate the real phishing site. So after I learned that, I just did the click here thing, landed on the real page, and I put in, again, fake credentials to begin with. The first time I put in fake credentials, I got this error code, which I'm not going to read out. And then I tried again with a real account, and I got the same error code. And no matter how many times I tried, it was always the same error code. So sadly, this time, I was really hoping for a similar adversary in the middle example because it was fun and cool. The attacker wasn't doing that. I looked at, over a couple of days, we looked at our logs, and we never saw any of the accounts that I seeded on our backend. But this made me think, it's like, well, what is it that the attacker is doing? And given that I have an AppSec background, I started to look at every single request issued by my browser to get a better understanding of what the attacker, like what my interactions with the site were doing. And then I saw this, which thankfully looks great on this screen. On the top part, you'll see that red arrow, and it's pointing to the location header, because that was a redirect. So like I put in whatever credentials, it would always say error.html, and that's that location header. If you look at the rest of this, it kind of just looks like nonsense, but if you look a little bit more closely, it probably looks like an SMTP log, doesn't it? I didn't hear any shock yet, but this was just a PHP web app, and what was happening was that the attacker, I guess, like set it up very poorly, and every time somebody put in their credentials into the real site, their backend was sending an email with the credentials to a collection of email, to a collection of email addresses. So they were harvesting the credentials, and I was able to figure that out because they did a poor job of configuring their server. And yeah, so over like the 2 or I think 4 weeks that I spent analyzing these, the attacker was always sending from those 2 email addresses, and they were always receiving at these 3. And you can kind of see that in here, and I can't walk away from the mic, but in red, you can see the email addresses that are being sent from and sent to. So after I figured this out, I spent more time digging into them. Every single one, all of the phishing sites associated with this campaign added up to about over 200, so hundreds, I could say. And yeah, the takedown times were often very slow because the hosting providers weren't aware that their infrastructure was being used this way. However, they got a lot better over time, and I don't want to shame them, so good job. And yeah, the other thing was that safe browsing can come in handy in situations where the registrars aren't being responsive. So in this case, the hosting providers weren't being responsive. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was that you're probably wondering, it's well, you knew that these were Gmail addresses, why didn't you try to work with Google on this? And the thing is that we didn't really know that, did we? The HTTP response just says that they're sending from these email addresses and receiving at these other email addresses. There's nothing to I can use to confirm that. I would have to engage with Google, and they said like, hey, without the email headers, that's not necessarily possible. However, the something that you may have noticed was that there were hundreds of these. And they were always sending from the same 2 email addresses, every single one. So that made me think, it's like, well, if I want to check up on these every day, and I want to put in a couple of accounts to every single one of these, and they were actually using Gmail, maybe I could just exhaust their ability to send emails that day. So every day, bright and early, I would wake up and I would see these accounts while having some coffee, which was not necessarily malicious. I was just doing something. And that was more than enough to slow them down. And eventually, between the hosting providers responding more promptly and the attacker not being able to harvest any email addresses because they no longer had the ability to send emails, that was enough to stop this campaign. Here were my takeaways from that. It was that use the HTTP refer header. It's a very good way to figure out what phishing sites are pointing back to you. I learned as well that not only the sign-in page, oftentimes when attackers are just mirroring your site, they won't do it for all of the links. So like stuff like your registration page, which is often on the login page, might be a good place to look for these. The other thing was that, much like in the first example, WAFs and HTTP redirects are used to evade detection, and like this is a very good, their anti-automation controls seem to be enough to slow down most vendors. And yeah, just like look at every HTTP request and response. You might get lucky and your attacker might be silly enough to disclose their SMTP logs. Sweet. So I think I have 9 minutes. I have 9 minutes left. Are there any questions in the Slido so far? Cool. I'm just going to continue going along then. So after I did this work at Gemini, I became the phishing guy, for better or for worse. And there was an instance where we started to receive emails to our support email, people claiming that they're just not even Gemini customers. Why are they getting emailed about a Gemini airdrop? And so yeah, the thing that was really hard was that, again, the registrar unresponsive did not seem to give a damn. But we knew that there were other ways to get around these things and improved the security posture of our users who were being impacted by this. So let's look a little bit into that. So this was the email that people were receiving. These 2 red arrows point to the fact that it is a domain that has nothing to do with us. We don't sell eco motors, not yet at least. And the other thing that stood out to me was that there was that code, which I did not put an arrow for, and there is this proceed now button. So this again is an email. And my specialty is things that do HTTP, not this. So I decided to click on that proceed now button and see where it would take me. And it took me here. And this, you probably can't see it in the back because it's kind of like white on white. But it was asking me for a code, which was this code. That code was the same for every single person that emailed us. This was just the attacker trying to, again, hinder automated efforts. Because if you don't know the code, you can't get in. If you'd like to check this out for yourself, again, you can go to URL scan. But yeah, so after I put in that code, it just sent me to this page, which looked exactly like our landing page, except that withdraw button. And when I clicked on that, it unfolded into something that I had not seen before, which you'll see in this slide. To recap, you click on the link that says click here for free crypto, and then they redirect you to a new site that says click on here to withdraw your free crypto, and then it will prompt you if you have like this little fox head, which I don't know if many of you know what it is. This is just a Web3 wallet, and it's used MetaMask because it's the most popular one. And it would ask you to connect your wallet, and after you connect it, it would collect some information, and if you approve the transfer, it would clean you out. So many users, or like many people tried to, and they just like connected their wallets. In many cases, they had nothing in there, thankfully, but it was a way for the attacker to exfiltrate all the credentials, just like using our brand. So this isn't necessarily something in our infrastructure. It's not typical like username and passwords or anything like that. This is just somebody leveraging our brand and using the ecosystem around us to try to extort people. So again, reported to safe browsing, the registrar and all that jazz. It had taken a couple of days still, and I feel uneasy about that. So we wanted to figure out, again, how to improve this impact on our brand. It's not our products, it's our brand. So that made me think, it's like, well, if the attacker is always depending on the user connecting their wallet, maybe there's something there. And then I learned about this project, the ETH Phishing Detect project. This is a project put together by MetaMask that allows you to report domains that are hosting phishing infrastructure that would allow you to more accurate or like more actively hinder their efforts. And in the cases where registrars aren't answering and safe browsing hasn't flagged it, this is honestly your best bet, and it happens within a couple days. So on the left-hand side, I just created a PR. On the right-hand side, you'll see what it looks like. Then it says, whenever you try to visit it with your wallet, it'll say, this domain has been reported for phishing. Please don't engage with them. So one thing that I wanted to highlight for you guys is like, when I mentioned that email at the beginning, it was there wasn't a domain associated with Gemini. It was just a random domain. And as I looked through all the emails, there were 6 different brands used for it. And all of those were Brazilian companies. They were all happened to be Brazilian media companies that apparently had gotten hacked. And you're probably asking me, well, how do you know that? One of them responded to me, and they confirmed that they had in fact been hacked by a previous employee who was leveraging their infrastructure to send out emails in this phishing campaign. So eventually we handed it over, and the Lord took the wheel. My takeaways for this was that pin thing at the beginning. When I relayed that to some of my other friends that have started to do this work, they were like, oh yeah, that is also a very good tactic. Not only anti-automation controls, but pins as well. Because in order to brute force them, it would take some time. And if you're working in the Web3 space and safe browsing and registrars aren't responding to you, you should really consider sending domains over to MetaMask. I sent one over this morning while sitting there while my coworker was taking a picture of me. And lastly, is like, remember to inform the impacted parties. In this case, some of the Brazilian marketing teams that were hacked found out about this because we told them. They didn't even know. Now for the wrap up. So if anything that you take away from this, I'd like for you to consider that analyzing attacker infrastructure can really help you understand the impact that it has on your customers, your security controls, and how you can make the whole ecosystem better. To be honest, I have no idea if you should or not. I'm not a thought leader. I'm just doing some work that I think has improved the security posture of these companies that I've engaged with. And lastly, it's like, if this is the first time that you're hearing about this kind of work and you want to see other people doing it in the industry, I've included a Pastebin link here with a list of blogs that I've collected over the last couple months that highlights this kind of work. And I think I'm right on time, so thank you for coming. My information's here on the right-hand side. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you so much. We do have one question on the Slido.
Hell yeah.
One question on the Slido. Have you tried to deploy phishing-resistant MFA like passkeys?
We have. So like so where I work, I can't speak of the first example. The company asked me to not mention them, but where I do work at Gemini, we do have we're using YubiKeys right now, or just like there's a plain WebAuthn setup and there's like a passkey setup. And those work out great for instances where users are getting phished, but there's a large ecosystem of users who don't want to use a passkey for whatever reasons. And it's like fallbacks and stuff like that have also like extended our timelines for passkeys. And the other thing is that those work out really well, but things like Web3 wallets are in a very different part of this, where like no amount of passkeys is going to prevent people from having their Web3 wallet cleaned out.
All right. Any more questions?
I can't see if you're raising your hand because of the light, but just shout.
If you're raising your hand, you can shout in the next minute or submit on Slido or have a reach out to Rick after the session.
Well,
All right.
Yeah.
With that, thank you so much, Rick.